So, hi everybody, welcome to the Planet Tracker Trays webinar. We're just waiting for a few more people to join, so we will be starting in a couple of minutes. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join this Planet Tracker Trays joint webinar. This afternoon, we're going to be discussing using financial leverage to tackle climate change, one forest at a time, with a particular focus on sort of the Gran Chaco in terms of the Planet Tracker report. And then James Roche from Trays will be explaining some of the recent sort of developments that they've made to the Trays finance system and how it can actually be used as a way of understanding the deforestation footprint of companies and financial institutions. And we'll also have a bit of discussion about how that works in practice from a Santander perspective. So I'm delighted to be joined by a couple of very experienced and expert panelists to sort of assist with this webinar. So James Roche is the Forest and Supply Chains lead from Neural Alpha. Neural Alpha is one of the organizations that sits behind Trays. James has got a long, complicated explanation of exactly how Trays is structured. So we'll learn a bit more about how he fits into that. He's going to explain the Trays finance system. If you've used it already, you'll have some awareness of its capability, but he'll really be able to help us understand how that can be used to see through supply chains to understand the move from sort of the beef or the soy in Latin America coming through and ultimately ending up as sort of attributable to financial institutions. And then also joined by Silvia Ciccarino. Delighted to have you. Thank you for joining, Silvia. So Silvia is the deputy head of the environmental and social risk team for Brazil with Santander. There's a lot of experience of actually using Trays in terms of understanding the risk that the bank is exposed to, particularly in Brazil. So that will be really interesting to actually hear somebody who uses it as a practical tool in a banking situation. But what I'd like to do first is to start by looking at a case study, an investigation that Planet Tracker did, looking at in this case, the soy trade coming out of the Gran Chaco. We will focus particularly on the sort of the Argentine section of that. Now, when James comes to explain Trays, he's actually going to focus a bit more on the beef supply chain. And there's a very strong linkage between the two. Generally, beef is what you might describe as the sort of the entry drug in terms of the deforestation cycle. So you tend to find that illegal loggers and other people will be chopping down the trees. They will then hand over the land to beef farmers, to ranchers, to grow cattle on the land for sort of a number of years, not necessarily that long a period of time, and then the land will be handed on to somebody to grow soy. So there's a very clear sort of causal link between the one and the other, and the soy trade is pretty sort of high value, and obviously soy is an extremely valuable commodity for the global food system, both in terms of human food and also food for animals, circling back round to the bottom of the beef supply chain. Now, in terms of the Gran Chaco and our investigation, the Gran Chaco is particularly important as one of the key forests in South America, and it's ignored to a great extent by institutions and by outsiders. It's much less well known than the Amazon, which is obviously very well known, and the Cerrado, which is also pretty well understood as well. So the Gran Chaco is a bit of a sort of poor third in terms of visibility, but from a deforestation perspective, severely threatened by the same sorts of practices as have been going on in both the Amazon and the Cerrado. And our investigation looked in detail at the sort of the legal protections being offered. And you can see from this, this slide, you may not be able to read all the small print on there depending upon the size of your screen, but broadly speaking, there are a reasonable range of protections in the Amazon, not always actually enforced in practice, but the legal framework exists. In the Cerrado, slightly less strong, but unfortunately in the Gran Chaco, the legal protections around that particular biome are really pretty low. And that's one of the reasons why obviously it's quite severely under threat. Now, our investigation showed, and again, James will sort of show how you can use trays to really sort of draw out these sorts of inferences. Our investigation showed that there are 12 traders who absolutely dominate the sort of exports coming out of the Gran Chaco. We sort of rather pejoratively labeled them the Deforestation Dozen, and you'll see why we took that slightly sort of harsh tone. But 12 traders controlling around about 90% of the trade. So if they would change their behavior, or if financial institutions who invest in them would sort of pressure them to do that, that would make a really enormous difference. And you can see from this table just how sort of dominant they are. And interestingly enough, in the Gran Chaco, no surprise perhaps because we were looking at the Argentinian section, there are a couple of Argentinian companies that really dominate the trade. Vicentin and Acietera General de Geza, the two really at the sort of the top of the list with a very sort of significant market share. And what this table is showing is the results of a WWF investigation, which we extended to look at the bottom three, looking at the deforestation sort of protections that these organizations have in place. And you can see that out of a possible score of 100, all of them are scoring very badly. Cargill just manages to tip over the 50% boundary, but really only by a smidge. And if you look at the different sort of criteria that we then examined in terms of their deforestation policy, including the Gran Chaco, a number of them, quite a large number of them, don't have that at all. Do they have any cutoff date in terms of the deforestation around the Gran Chaco? No, they don't. And so across that. So you can see that the actual policies and processes that these organizations have in place are really very weak. They're certainly not fit for purpose in terms of protecting the Gran Chaco. Now, one of the other interesting things that we looked at in terms of this study was we did a fairly sort of crude modeling exercise to say, well, if you attributed a carbon price to the carbon generated by the deforestation going on in the Gran Chaco, and then you fed that through into the soy that was coming out, how would the soy price change if you had that deforestation carbon footprint priced in? And you can see that the change would be really very dramatic. The soy price would effectively triple. And clearly on that basis, it would be uneconomic for companies to buy soy from that particular biome. And I think that's a really important thing to understand. We're seeing a number of regulatory changes beginning to bubble up, particularly through the EU, where both in terms of carbon pricing and also in terms of deforestation due diligence, regulators, governments are beginning to require companies at the bottom end of the supply chain to be much more cautious about the products that they're buying and where they're buying them from. And that creates a potential challenge for organizations that are exporting soy and beef from biomes like this without having those protections in place. The other thing that we looked at, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because James will be able to demonstrate a sort of more up-to-date version, but we looked at the institutions supporting these traders. We used trays as one of the tools to help us to examine this, and you can see that you can quite quickly identify the organizations that are primarily responsible for providing the funding. And no surprise that BlackRock and Vanguard come very high up the list, but there are a number of other organizations and indeed individuals who are supporting particular traders operating in this biome. And again, from a sort of from an engagement perspective, we would want to see those institutions really strengthening their deforestation policies and putting pressure on these companies that they're providing funding to. Similarly, with the banks lending to these organizations, Cargill, for example, is a private company, so not really exposed to public market investment, but very much exposed from a borrowing perspective. So lenders have significant power in this context. And it's disappointing to see that lenders have remarkably sort of few policies, if you like, in this context, particularly in relation to the Gran Chaco. So our ask of financial institutions is that they should adopt policies to eliminate deforestation from their portfolios. A number have done, but it's disappointing to note with surveys like, for example, the Forest 500, that around about 2/3 of financial institutions have still really failed to have effective deforestation policies in relation to both lending and also investment. And then once you've got the policies in place, obviously we would want to see those organizations actually sort of taking action on the back of the policies and really engaging with food systems, particularly regarding the Gran Chaco, which we see as a sort of specifically threatened biome, but more broadly in terms of all the areas where deforestation is taking place. They have a really important role to play. Okay, I'll stop at that point and hand over to James to explain a little bit more about the TRACE finance system and just the power of the tool and what it can actually help investors and other people to do. So, James, thank you. Over to you.
Brilliant, thanks, Peter, and yeah, thanks for the introduction and that insight from the Planet Tracker report there. Yeah, my name, as Peter's already said, is James Roach. I am the Forest and Supply Chains lead for Neural Alpha, and we are the lead fintech partner within TRACE. Now, there are plenty of forest and supply chains experts within TRACE, so I don't claim a monopoly on that title at all. And just to give you a flavor, TRACE is a wide kind of program partnership founded by Stockholm Environment Institute and Global Canopy, and Neural Alpha are one of the partners in that partnership. And what do we do? Well, the mission of TRACE, is to improve supply chain transparency, and that comes down to mapping supply chains, bringing together disparate data sets, and also providing advisory services, as well as the 3 tools that are publicly available, and those are the TRACE Earth, TRACE Finance, which we'll talk about today, and TRACE Insights as well. So to give a bit of an overview as to what TRACE does, principally we map the middle part of the supply chain. So we're taking data on production from municipalities within an individual country. Here the example is beef, but we cover soy, palm oil as well as cocoa and other commodities. But fundamentally, we do a lot of work mapping the domestic supply chains of these commodities down to the ports, and then through the exporters and importers and into the ports in the country of import. Now, we don't map that downstream part of the supply chain all the way down to the consumers. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in that, as well. And if I were to sort of zoom out from this supply chain and kind of, and look at it in terms of the number of actors, it's a really hourglass shape. Okay, so around the commodity traders, around the exporters and the importers, we have a real narrowing of a smaller number of actors, where obviously in the production side of things, that there are more and more complex interactions. And so that commodity trader, narrowing, I suppose, is the point at which we kind of enter with the TRACE Finance offering. So TRACE Finance takes that supply chain data that we've already mentioned, and we take the traders, and then we build out and enrich the information around those. So we include legal entity hierarchies, for example, ownership information. We include organization data and commonly used financial identifiers to assist the financial industry in kind of mapping those into their own systems. And then we also include, crucially, securities and loans data, the holders of those securities, as well as banks who may be issuing loans. And that allows us to draw that link back from the holders and the banks via the commodity traders down to location-specific deforestation exposure and also commodity volume production. So who is TRACE Finance for? Principally, it's for asset managers and banks. You won't be surprised to hear. For the asset owners and asset managers side of things, we can support things like portfolio screening, for deforestation risk, as well as universe construction, and also, spot checks on individual organizations, whether they're directly or indirectly exposed to deforestation. And secondly, to banks and to financial services providers, we can provide, tools for doing due diligence. The highly specific, sourcing data that we have, combined with legal entity hierarchies, and the other detailed information we hold about these organizations, really facilitates that. And with incoming EU due diligence legislation, that becomes, even more of a focus for us. Now, over the last year, we've actually expanded Trace Finance to cover from 3 country commodity contexts to cover 6. And you won't be surprised to learn that the 3 we've added this year are all with direct relevance to the Chaco. So we've added coverage for Paraguayan beef, Argentinian soy, and Paraguayan soy as well. I will add, of course, that the Chaco does extend into Bolivia, though we don't actually include commodities associated with that. So it's worth just highlighting that. And for those 3 commodities, we have, annual coverage on deforestation exposure and production volumes from 2014 through to 2019. So now onto the onto the data. So exposure to the Chaco is pervasive. Many investor groups are exposed across, several thousand funds. But it comes down to 34 securities in 12 exposed commodity traders. So that exposure is really quite concentrated, and that's to our advantage in understanding this problem. So if we move to look at the individual commodity traders and who is exposed and where, there's a really interesting pattern here. So we're plotting deforestation exposure here across the dry Chaco and the humid Chaco. For beef and for soy. And we can see straight away that the deforestation exposure for beef, and particularly in the dry Chaco, so that's Western Paraguay, is an order of magnitude higher than for the other contexts and biome combinations. And as Peter mentioned earlier, that's a slight simplification because of this sort of land use cascade that you get. So a lot of the initial deforestation is carried out and the land use is changed to cattle pasture. And then over time, as land use improvement happens, then we get soy coming in behind. But for the last few years, this is a real frontier of deforestation, in a global sense. And chief amongst the exposed there is Minerva, who are publicly traded beef trader with us, a very significant exposure. And just to talk to some of the other organizations here, you have this group of Paraguayan entities, cooperatives, some associated with the Mennonites, and then you've got the kind of the other kind of soy traders as well. Some of the more publicly traded names, Bunge and ADM, Cargo, etc. So there's interest, I think, in both of those. Sorry, I'll get back to the right slide. There we go. So just to talk to those private companies and then the local entities here, these are material to us because a lot of these entities are actually reaching out to Western banks either for loans or issuing debt securities. I think we've already touched on Vicentin, for example. They're in receipt of a loan from Rabobank at the moment, and with incoming due diligence legislation in the EU, that represents a material risk to some of these banks. So, being able to expose this information is really important in those processes. So we then move on to look at the asset managers and who has exposure. As Peter's already sort of touched on, the answer is most people, and unsurprisingly, BlackRock and Vanguard are up there. And I think most of that exposure is generally via passive ETFs, unsurprisingly. Sector exposure, I think we have to be frank, is a necessary part of a lot of these strategies, particularly, in the case of hedging against inflation, etc. But I think, we should put some more priority on engaging on those companies engaging with some of these traders to try and move the dial. And then in terms of active approaches, you've seen the different profiles in terms of deforestation exposure out there. And so, it's quite a straightforward in some ways thing for active managers to make choices around this. So if I move forward and look at the kind of equity share of Chaco deforestation amongst those FIs, well, you can see first of all that Saulic here are somewhat skewing this plot. They have a 10% stake in Minerva. And so that kind of skews. But if we move them off to the left, we can have a little bit more of a look at who's here in terms of the more common names that we're familiar with. One of the things we can see here is that actually, deforestation exposure doesn't necessarily scale with AUM or number of holdings, though those big players are there. But individual holdings in particular actors, in this case Minerva, drive deforestation risk that is very significant in terms of this biome. So this is a Dutch pension fund, for example, here that with a single holding in Minerva pushes their exposure higher than some of the other big players who are more diversified in terms of their holdings. We also have several actors in here with who are invested in across both soy and beef. And finally, I want to touch on some information around ESG and SRI funds. So it's worth saying, first of all, that 99% of Chaco deforestation is associated with funds that are kind of conventional investment funds, but we do track 234 that are labeled ESG or SRI. And a lot of those have holdings in the soy traders, ADM and Bunge, and 4, in fact, have holdings in Minerva. Now, again, almost all of these exposed funds are passive ETFs or index trackers. Though special mention does go to the State Street Fund, which is actively managed, which is an interesting example, to hone in on, because this kind of highlights this poor progress around deforestation screening for ESG funds. I think this is probably an example of a fund that's jumping on that ESG bandwagon, doing sort of minimum effort, and really deforestation doesn't feature at all in that in that ESG rating. So yeah, progress is poor, and as you can see here, just one holding in Minerva massively skews, as we've seen before, the deforestation exposure compared to 10 or 15 in the soy traders. So yeah, we'd really like to see more progress on bringing that deforestation exposure into ESG decision making. So to sum up, then. It's clear, and I think Peter touched on as well, that exposure to Chaco deforestation and the Chaco generally it tends to be overlooked in favor of those somewhat more high-profile regions. But deforestation is a massive issue there, and the problem is manageable. Chaco deforestation is driven by a small number of actors that we can engage with, and we can make straightforward decision making around. And Trace Finance gives us those tools to inspect these links and to reduce risk and hopefully to drive material change in the Chaco. And with that, I will conclude. And yeah, I think I'll hand back to Peter.
Thanks very much indeed, James. If you can take the screen off share, that would be helpful. Fantastic. So a number of really interesting points coming out of what James was sort of talking through there, and we don't have time to sort of really demonstrate the system live, but I wanted to bring Sylvia in at this point because I know, Sylvia, you actually use the Trace system sort of in your process, so it's not just a sort of an academic exercise, it's not just a sort of a one-off thing. Can you just sort of briefly talk us through how you actually use this tool? What are the benefits? And maybe if there are things that you'd actually like to see added to it, now's a great chance to throw in some requests into the pot. So over to you.
Okay, thank you for this, Peter. I'm gonna explain more for a due diligence perspective. So here in Santander, we have environmental and social and climate risk management policy. It's public. You can see this document in our global website. In this policy applies for 4 different sectors, and one of them is the soft commodity sector. And in order of us to perform a better assessment, a better due diligence, we have established high risk geography zones. So for us, South America and Chaco, especially, of course, Amazon region or this area in Brazil, the center part of Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia. So they all of these areas are defined as high risk geographies, mainly because of the deforestation risk. Of course, we have other parts in the world. Well, we have some parts in Asia, in Africa. So this list can also be reviewed if we can notice that there are a major risk, arising from different areas. So, saying that, when I'm assessing clients, I need to do a deeper dive to see how they are, implementing their commitments, how they are, if they are establishing goals or not. So I use Trace to help me to run through it. So in the beginning, I started using Trace for a long time before they have launched the Trace Finance. I used to do a table by myself to compare clients, to see all the deforestation, the probability of having deforestation purchase in their supply chain. So after the Trace Finance was launched, so I prepared my own watch list, so I can check, I can verify and see if they have policy, if they have deforestation policy, if they are a member of the New York Declaration, things like that. But I think that the main use that I for Trace for me is being able to see in the screen, especially when I look the flows. Now we're talking about the Trace.earth. The risk, the deforestation risk associated to those companies. And with this information, I can engage the client. I can ask what they are doing, because I'm not saying that they, if they have bought soy from deforested land, but I always say, there is a probability here. So how can you explain, how do you manage, what, mitigation systems do you have in place to avoid this kind of risk in your chain? So I think Trace helped me to make the right questions. They help, all the data help me to engage the client. So I think that, well.
Oh, you've muted yourself, Sylvia.
Sorry, I think is the main use. I like it a lot. Yeah. So my boss always say it's like my video game, because I'm always looking for data, searching if they have any update information because it's a good way, to get information so you can engage your clients.
That's really, really clear. Thank you. Yeah, and I'm interested. Obviously, your job is to look at things from a risk perspective, but I'm really interested that you can then use it to engage with the companies that you're sort of potentially considering lending to, and actually ask them about their risk policies as well. And you're not necessarily expecting to find a smoking gun or a section of forests that's sort of in flames, but you can say, well, you're operating in this area. You are at risk of these sorts of behaviors. How are you working to tackle that? And I was interested, Sylvia, you mentioned one particular point. You said, Santander has a policy, it's published, it's on the website. Now, I mean, Santander is a sort of a standout. It's a sort of unusual, unfortunately, in this context, in having a policy, and particularly having a policy that sort of includes a focus on the Gran Chaco. And I mean, this is a slightly unfair question because you don't work for all those other banks, but I just wondered, you know, what was it that led Santander to get sort of so granular and so detailed? And that's certainly something I think, you know, James and I would both want to see other banks doing. So what was it that led Santander to that point? And maybe, you know, can you identify with other banks that haven't? Is there something obvious that's creating a blockage, or is it really just that, you know, maybe they're being a bit slow or unimaginative?
I can talk more why Santander has this, you know, high geography risk zones. I think when we talk about the Chaco, I think it's related also to our background, you know, because we are a RTRS member. Chris Wells, who I work with, was the first president of the roundtable. So we have been dealing with the Chaco for a long time, and we know that deforestation, it's a real situation there. And in the past, I was also responsible for the Paraguayan operation that we had when we were from ABN, because Santander bought ABN operation in Brazil. So we have been working with the Chaco, not only in Argentina, but also in Paraguay, not nowadays because we do not have a presence in Paraguay, but we do have in Argentina. So we know that the Chaco is suffering as much as our Cerrado, and there's not, you know, I think we don't have enough information. We don't have a lot of legislation. The compass don't talk a lot about the Chaco. That used to happen with Cerrado when we look in the early 2000, 2005, 2006. Cerrado wasn't, you know, in the center of the discussion as it is now. So I think Chaco, it's just like the same. So that's why, because we know that it's a real problem there and need to tackle it. So that's the reason why we decide to establish high risk zones. So we know where we need to pay special attention. It doesn't mean that we're not going to look, you know, this kind of risk in other regions, but those ones that we have already defined. So it's like a yellow sign, you know, you need to pay attention here. That's why.
That's really clear. That's great. So there's actually a question come in sort of asking a related point, which is, you know, whether financial institutions need a specific Chaco policy or can it be covered by more general deforestation? I mean, James, you know, this is something that you've obviously looked at through sort of the trades finance work. I mean, what's your thinking on that? Is a general deforestation policy good enough, or actually do you need to do what Sylvia and Santander have done and become a lot more granular?
Well, I think it's all about degrees, right? Like, you know, as Sylvia's hinted, you know, you need that umbrella policy, but I think you also need those, you know, location, geography specific policy in there, so you can kind of, you know, you can flag, you know, and flag something for, you know, enhanced due diligence around specific high risk areas. So yes, I would say you do need that, but it needs to sit, you know, in a kind of tiered manner so that you can really, you know, dive down into the detail where the risk is higher.
And so that's good. And I think you're sort of, you know, layering sort of concept again that chimes very strongly with what Sylvia was talking about in terms of, we understand sort of the general problem, but actually we also understand this particular sort of biome, this particular region is sort of threatened for the reasons that we've talked about already, the fact that it's got sort of, you know, weaker legal protections, and therefore the risk, going back to sort of Sylvia's perspective, the risk is much higher. We've got a number of questions sort of coming in. I mean, here's another sort of general one, and maybe this is one more for you, James, but do you see investment consultants engaging on behalf of pension fund clients in this area? And I mean, Sylvia, I don't know whether those are sorts of questions that might work their way back to you, or whether that would be dealt with other people within Santander. But, you know, clearly asset owners, the pension funds, ultimately they should be sort of asking these questions. Is that something that you're picking up, James? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think, I think we should be certainly asking these questions to try and, just assert more pressure, on those actors for sure. Yeah, and I think, pooling resource where we're questioning, questioning actions is certainly important. Yeah.
And Sylvia, from a Santander perspective, I mean, sort of turning around from it, you guys are putting a lot of effort into this sort of process using trays, your due diligence, sort of investigating deforestation risk, and that's a risk mitigation measure. But does it also become a positive? I mean, is this something that you can use to actually attract business into Santander? Does it have, if you like, a marketing spin to it or something like that? Or is it all about risk mitigation?
I use it mainly for risk mitigation, but I do think that we can, we can think about opportunities, because when you have a risk, you also have an opportunity in that situation. So what we are doing right now, we are using trace to try to identify our exposure, our portfolio exposure regarding the EU legislation. And maybe if we work in advance, we can, engage clients. So I do think it can use it as an opportunity. And also, why not? If you identify a risk zone and maybe engage clients talking about specific certifications like RTNS and others. So I think that we can use these tools also for opportunity.
No, that's really good point to raise. I think it's always easy to think about the risks initially, but I think the opportunities are really important. We're coming towards the close of this webinar, but there was one other point that I wanted to just sort of raise. I mean, a point came out of our report, and obviously you highlighted as well, James, the fact that there's a really small group of traders operating in the Gran Chaco, and the same is true of a number of other biomes as well. That sort of hourglass shape with a real concentration of sort of power in the traders. Why should they change their behavior? It feels as though it's very important that they do. They have a lot of influence, but do they need to? They're very profitable doing what they do. Do you have a sense as to what might persuade them to act differently, to have stronger policies, for example, in relation to the Gran Chaco? What do you think? What's going to make the traders better?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reputational risk, I think particularly for some of these beef traders, should be more significant. I think compared to soy, for example, there's less certification, there's less kind of oversight there. So I think, I think as the finance industry, and also from a kind of consumer perspective, I think there needs to be more light shone there. So to really create leverage for some of those, particularly the beef traders. And it's a slightly more complex question, I guess, across the board. I think we have to try and kind of build a consensus, to try and persuade change across the whole supply chain, and in the finance sector as well, to leverage, because as you say, they're profitable. There's not much on the ground in their way, particularly in terms of legal protections and things like that. So I think we have to use tools at our disposal to exert as much pressure as possible.
And Sylvia, just sort of give you the last word, as it were, and as a practitioner, somebody operating practically in this environment and trying to use your financial leverage to reduce deforestation, what's one key thing that you would see as a step that maybe other banks should be adopting to sort of meet the same sort of standards as Santander?
I think that when you have data and when we have information, you have, the capability to make the right question. You have the capability to measure the risk. So I think what the banks should perform a due diligence and try to engage as much as we can, so as much as the bank can engage the clients in order to try to make a transformation. I think we know that we can we can get, sometimes we are closer to the client, so we can establish a dialogue with them. So I think using tools like Trace give us, the information here's the power. Now, getting the information is really important, so we can make a better engagement with the client. I think this would be the advice, that doing better due diligence and use the data as much as we can, so we can make the right questions.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a really, really good way of sort of summarizing what we've been talking about today, I think. So thank you both. Thank you, James. Thank you, Sylvia, for your input. Thank you to everybody who's dialed in to watch this webinar. There were a number of questions we didn't get a chance to answer live, so we'll be going through those afterwards, and we'll get back in touch with you to try and sort of address those questions. Obviously, you've got our contact details, so feel free to reach out to James and to me. Maybe Sylvia's sort of role doesn't allow her necessarily to engage with a lot of outside people. She's got a day job to focus on, which is very much to do with lending. But really like to thank you, Sylvia, for contributing to this. It's fantastic to get a sort of practical examples of how you're using this tool. And to anybody else who's thinking of using trays in the way that Sylvia is, obviously James and his colleagues would be really keen to sort of talk and engage with you on that, and so would I and my Planet Tracker colleagues. So once again, thank you very much indeed for dialing in, and hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.